It's very exciting what Historic Saranac Lake is doing. We all see the progress on the building every day, and it's looking great. It's looking really wonderful. So, I thought I would start today by reading you something out of the last book I published, and it's called Tumbleweed Years. It just came out a couple of months ago, and it's tumbleweed because I've tumbled through life. I've tumbled from one place to another, and I've tumbled from one job to another, so that's the title. And I'll read you this. Bid at 30 now, 30, would you go to 40? I hear 40. Numbers were rattled off in a mesmerizing chant. The crowd listened, huddled in a semi-dark, unheated warehouse beneath a domed wooden roof. Now 40, would you give me 40? Would you give me 50? Now 50, would you go to 60? Come on, folks, chance of a lifetime. It's never been opened, key lost, might be treasure here. 60, 60, no one else bid. Going twice, going, gone. Down came the gavel. Sold for 50 to the man in the blue wool hat. The man in the blue wool hat was our son Christopher. It was 1998. My husband and I stood with him and his family in the long, drafty storage shed at one time a well-loved curling rink in Saranac Lake, New York. Christopher, always up for a little adventure, gave a big grin as he claimed his win. Bill Madden, whose family owned Madden's Transfer and Storage, where the auction was held, smiled and strolled over to us and said, "Chris, you might have gotten the best deal here today." And what was that deal? It wasn't furniture, which had already been auctioned off. It wasn't equipment or anything useful at all. It was a locked, black, flat-topped trunk left for storage many years ago. Nobody had returned to claim it. Who knew what might be made inside? Treasure? It was fastened shut with tarnished brass clamps and a large lock. Oh. So would you like to hear more?
Yes.
Well, good, because that shows the power of a story and of storytelling. And stories are the best way to gain folks' attention and take them on an exciting journey into history. People get bogged down in facts and figures, but not if these are couched in a good story. And by the way, Bunk was a great storyteller. The writer's job is to put the story in context, to portray the beliefs and customs surrounding the story. I think this is what British historian and academic George Trevelyan referred to when he wrote, "Let the science and research of the historian find the fact, and let his imagination and art make clear its significance." I envision it like this. A writer's story and its setting is the ground in which the seeds of historical dates and facts will best flourish. Stories, after all, are the traditional way information has been passed down for generations. The second point I want to make is that stories can be either fact and real, or they can be fiction, but they're equally important to history. Regardless of the format, good stories are usually set in surroundings that are true to the times. And I think with stories about Saranac Lake, a lot of them are true, a lot of them are fiction, but they always have surroundings and settings that are real. They always refer to real events that took place at Saranac Lake. So the story doesn't always have to be real, it can be fiction, and it still has historical importance. And the third point I want to make is history is not just in the past, it is daily in the making. And I think we often overlook what's going on today in our interest in history. But if we don't record and save what's happening today, it won't be there for future generations. And I think as an example, when I was working on a research for my Adirondack ice book, I was looking for photos of buildings being moved across the ice. And I couldn't find any. I had the hardest time finding them. And yet, it was done constantly. It was a common occurrence. And I finally did find a very nice photo. But the reason I think nobody took photos was because everybody was doing it. It wasn't a big deal. And I think the same thing applies today. We need to take a close look at what's going on today and preserve it. So what triggers a writer to explore history, either past or present? Well, it could be a place like this place, when somebody wants to write history about this place, or say Camp Sagamore, where somebody wants to write history about Camp Sagamore. It could be a person. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Charles Wardner, who wrote his father's stories, and his father was based in the Rainbow Lake area. And he wrote a book called, let me think for a minute, what was it? Oh, Footprints and Sunset on Adirondack Trails. It's a tremendous book. And it was just inspired by listening to his father's stories, and he put it into print. Or it could be artifacts. And I guess we have Andy Flynn as an example, who wrote a whole series of books about the artifacts he found in the attic of Adirondack Experience. And he built stories out of them. So my husband and I moved here 22 years ago. And it started my second career. In fact, the only career I ever had. Before that, I just went from one thing to another. But I started really writing seriously here. And the first trigger was when Mike Delahunt from this Robert Louis Stevenson cottage asked me to do some guiding over there and to fill in for him. Well, you can't fill in for Mike Delahunt because he knows more than any man in the world about Stevenson. But I did my best. And I did a crash course on Stevenson, and I did some guiding for 2 or 3 days. And one of the things that surprised me is that tourists coming through knew nothing about Saranac Lake. They didn't know anything about its history. They knew it was beautiful, they knew it was a great place to go hiking, to go boating, but they didn't know anything about the history. So I thought, we need a brochure, we need a flyer to pass out in all the motels and the hotels and the restaurants, giving people a quick summary of the history and telling them where they could learn more about it and where they could get walking tours at historic Saranac Lake. And so I put together this trifold. This was years ago, about Saranac Lake. And I put on the top, before you leave here, find out where you've been. And that was the flyer. And I think it was used for several years. It's since been replaced, but for several years that was used. So, my next trigger was Jean DeMattos. Most of you know Jean DeMattos. So Jean DeMattos was a one-woman welcoming committee for Saranac Lake. She was also an everywhere volunteer who you could not say no to. And she invited me to have lunch with a group of women who met weekly at the Hotel Saranac for 20 years. And one of them, about the third time I went to lunch there, one of them, Bea Drutz, you all know Bea Drutz, do you remember her? She worked for the Adirondack Daily Enterprise. And Bea Drutz said, everybody talks about the history of Saranac Lake, but nobody's asked us for our stories. Well, bingo, what a prompt for a writer. I couldn't pass that one up. So I did the writing, Mark Kurtz did the photographs, and we put together a book about these 16 women, and I wrote up their stories, and in between the lines, I added information, and many of you are familiar with this book, information about the events and places that they mentioned, And thus the book is called, I think you're all familiar with it, History Between the Lines, Women's Lives, and Saranac Lake Customs. I would just pause here to say that oral histories are hugely important, and I commend anyone who's doing recordings. But I think you need to go a step further. I think you need to put them in hard copy. Because I think things saved digitally don't necessarily last. The technology changes, the programs aren't always updated, they don't always fit. It's hard to get access to them sometimes. You have to go someplace and look them up. If you have them in hard copy, it can sit on your coffee table, it can sit in your shelves, you can pass it to a friend. And also it allows you to put those oral histories in context. So you add the dates and you add what's going on in the village at the time and what's going on in the state, maybe what's going on nationally. So in context, the stories have more value, I believe. My third trigger to write was when I started working, helping to build the Ice Palace in Saranac Lake. I think I started in 2004. I was amazed how much there is to know about ice and how much you had to know to build that kind of a construction project. And so I started asking people what they knew about ice. And one person would say, well, my grandfather was a national speed skating champ. And another would say, the ice took out our docks last year. And another would say that damn black ice on the roads. Mm-hmm. And I started to think, oh, there's more to ice than I thought. So I spent the next 3 years researching ice, and I put together the book that you're probably all familiar with, Adirondack Ice, A Cultural and Natural History. And it's the influence of ice starting with the glaciers on life up here. The next thing that sparked my interest was we got to know a lot of people who are caretakers. And I thought that was pretty interesting. I said, well, tell me what you do, what's it like, and who do you take care of, and what goes on? And they said, oh no, we can't talk about that. That's confidential. We're pledged to confidentiality. So of course, I immediately wanted to know more about that. And so I made a deal with the caretakers. I said, if I never write out, and I never use the names, and I never use places and the events you tell me, if I record parallel accounts, would you talk to me? I won't even thank you in the preface to the book, which I didn't do, by the way. And so they did talk to me, and I thought it was a fascinating culture that most of us know little about unless we're caretakers. And so I recorded all of these, all this information. But then what do you do with it? You can't just throw it out there. It's not that interesting. So I thought it needs a story. So I wrote a novel. And then the setting for the novel is the great camps. And the great camp, the caretakers of the great camps. And also a little bit about small town life in the north. It's called On Thin Ice, The Life and Times of a Northwoods Caretaker. It first came out under the title Tibeta's World, but everyone thought it was a children's book. So I had to go back and start again, new cover, new title. But I'll read you a little bit out of this. And in here I referenced Meltmore, which was the village I write about, but you can sort of read Saranac Lake here instead of that. Hospital bound, siren wailing, an ambulance flies along the road, pushing trucks and cars out of the way. In Meltmore, where everyone knows everyone, any siren is a cause for alarm. Folks wonder who the freight on board may be, and which colleagues has been mowed down by fate. Those listening to police scanners, which many do, learn the news and pass it along. In no time at all, it flows like water, flooding through the cafe and the bar crowd, then down the street to post office patrons, gas station customers, and grocery shoppers. Quote, Ace Loneby fell off the roof at the Green River Hunt Club. So that's just a little piece of fun I had writing about that. The next thing was, working at the Ice Palace, of course, tourists were constantly asking us questions like, where's the ice come from? Another brilliant question. And so I thought we need a booklet explaining the history of the Ice Palace and where the ice comes from and how we build it and what equipment we use and how we do it. So I put together, I don't have more of these right now, but there are up in the gift shop. Saranac Lake's Ice Palace. This is the updated version. We've put out 2 versions of this. Again, Mark Kurtz did much of the photography, and Skip Murray did some, Shelley Manchester did some. And it not only had a chapter of my ice book explaining about the palace, but it also had photographs and text explaining how the palace is built and how we go about it and what's involved. And then it had quotes from volunteers on why they do this insane thing, which is work like dogs for 2 weeks in the freezing cold to build a fairy tale palace that then comes down a week later. And I've got to say, when I heard they were doing this, my first thought is, I want to join them. So that's how I got into it. So I did that. The next trigger to my historic writing came when Skip Murray, who was a wonderful photographer locally, came to me and said, do you want to collaborate on a book? And I said, I'd love to. I thought, I'd love to collaborate on books. That's great. So we sat down together and we tried to think what we'd collaborate about. He had only lived here 6 years at the time. I'd been here 20. We started talking about Saranac Lake and what a vibrant community it was with the arts and the music and sports and the scenery and the hiking and everything. And we said, that's it. We'll write about Saranac Lake. And so our concept was not to write about the history, because a lot's been written about the history, but to write about Saranac Lake as it is today, preserved for future generations. And so we did it. It's this book. I think a lot of you are familiar with it. But that was our intention. No history and all a portrait today. The book was reviewed by somebody who complained there was no history in it. Well, that was our intention. But
you snuck someone.
There's a little in there. And so he did the wonderful photography. I did what's called ekphrastic writing, which means writing inspired or associated with a picture. And so I would look at his picture he took, and I would write from that. And one of the pictures is of a stone retaining wall. Being a New Englander, stone walls to me were always freestanding stone walls. And I never was conscious of how many stone walls there are in Saranac Lake, because it's all built on hills, and we have retaining walls all over the place, until Phil Gallows gave a lecture on stone walls. And I was like, wow, I never thought about that. They're everywhere. And since then, I've really looked at them. So I'll read you what I wrote about the stone walls. In this mountain village of slopes and terraces, we ask stone walls to retain the land based on our own design, not nature's. And yet the stones, covered with lichen and moss, do as we ask, protecting our streets, our walks, our abodes from sliding down. Each wall different, each a treasure, gifts from skilled forebears who labored long and hard on these lasting works of art. Some of cut stone, others natural rock. Some sagging, others still straight. Most with drain holes, a few not. Supporting the village with tough endurance as we must support each other. So that was one. And I'll read you one about Art Walk, because we're used to Art Walk. We sort of take it for granted. They come around every summer. But who knows? Who knows if they'll ever be here for a long time, or if they'll be interrupted and we decide to move. So Skip did multiple photos of Art Walk, and I wrote this. Artist wares that will delight await perusal at numerous sites. Paintings, carvings, books galore, Stilt walkers, poets, musicians for sure. Artists and viewers hold conversations, young, old, all generations. Evening filled with music and talk, stretched along the crowded walk. Jewelry makers and fabric designers, restaurants welcome evening diners. Melodies soaring, drums thumping, strings singing, keyboards plunking. A vibrant place to take a stroll, to hear a band at the water hole. Thursdays at 5 o'clock, this gala happens, both music and art, as downtown starts to roll and rock. So that's just a couple out of that, but we had a wonderful time putting this book together. The last trigger, I think it might be my last trigger, because it's been a lot of books, is a book called Tumbleweed Years. It just came out a couple of months ago. And it's a collection of memorable adventures in my life, or adventures you might say, and stories. And the trigger was my files overflowing with all of these things I've written through the years, and they were homeless. So I gave them a home. They're in this book. So, do you want to hear more about the trunk story? There was the trunk story. Okay, we'll go on to the trunk story. So our son brought the trunk home to his house. It was 1998. We were visiting at the time, and he busted the lock on it, carried the trunk inside into the living room, and I will read you this. It was a wardrobe trunk. A wardrobe trunk. I have a picture of one here, but it's too little. Okay, so Christopher built a fire in the stove to warm the chilly living room in their old Victorian home. Jen put our grandchildren down for naps, then served us coffee. We gathered around to begin unpacking the former trunk owner's life. All eyes were immediately drawn to what was clearly a rifle, leaning against the back, wrapped in unbleached muslin and held in place with string. We carefully unwrapped it to discover what looked like a sawed-off shotgun. Bootlegger. The northern Adirondacks being an area known for their infamous trade, it was a natural assumption. Why did the owner of this trunk have such a gun carefully wrapped and hidden inside? We were most curious, but had to lay the gun aside for now, hoping to find answers in the rest of the man's belongings. And I think we sort of did, and I'd leave it to you later to read this if you want. Part of our help discovering information about the gun goes to Chris Gramone down at Woods and Water, and his son, Sam Gramone and his son Chris, who did the research on the gun, and it turned out to be a very interesting gun. But that's for later. We didn't know what that was about. One thing that immediately we found, which was fascinating, was unbleached wool underwear. The waist was about this wide. The legs were about this long. They'd been pinned up with safety pins, and the arms had been pinned up with safety pins. They're about 40% of their original length. I wish we had had a camera and taken a picture, but we were not photo prone in those days, because we had to throw it all out. It was moldy and rank, but it was very interesting because we had a picture of who owned the trunk. At least we had a vision of what this person must have looked like. And so we went on from there. We discovered other things in the trunks that are in the story later that you can find out about. And then I say, the remaining drawers were filled with loose pages and notebooks, some held together with straight pins. We continued our quest to learn who the owner of this trunk had been. Jennifer, our daughter-in-law, was silently thumbing through a pile of papers in her lap, when suddenly she spoke up. I've got his name. It's on a W-2 form from 1944. Nelson Blanchett. So, progress. The hunt was on. Just who was Nelson Blanchett? And we go on to look at papers in this trunk. In later years, I tried to trace Nelson Blanchett in Canada, and I found that there are about 2,571 Nelson Blanchetts in Canada, so that didn't take me anywhere. Anyway, we went on and we found sheets of paper with the names of different places in the country, in the state and out of state, Rochester and Ithaca and Albany, with dollar signs next to them. So that was a mystery. So we tried to figure out what that was all about. This man kept everything. And then my husband Will, who until now had been sitting quietly in an easy chair, sifting through an assortment of documents, looked up and said, "Here's an interesting handwritten note dated April 1959 from Dr. C. Bradley Sageman. It states that Nelson Blanchett had been under his care, and quote, in the past year he has had no pains and has improved to the extent that he can return to his work as a chauffeur." So now we had more information, what the dollar amounts were, what the places were. It was hard, it was handwritten, it was hard to read the names. One of them was Mrs. Loam, Bosch and Loam, that he drove, I think, to Rochester. And it was hard to read some of the other names. But we went on. There were multiple documents. We had a great time as a family looking at them. But then life got in the way. That was 1998. We had not moved here yet. We moved here in 2002. I started working for our son in his construction business. The trunk and all the contents the trunk, I don't know what happened to the trunk, but the contents got set aside. And just a few years ago, somebody mentioned something about a trunk, and I said, oh, the trunk, I have to go back to those papers. So I went back to the trunk and the papers, and I started doing research, and it was the most exciting research. It was so much fun. So I found out a lot about this man. But then I wanted to figure out what happened to him. Why did he not come back for his trunk? So one of the destinations he had mentioned was West Palm Beach, Florida. So I thought, I wonder if he went down there and died down there, and why didn't he come back? So I started going through the archives of newspapers down in Florida, and sure enough, I found his obituary. It was very severe, very brief. It just said that the dates were correct. I know it was him, the name was correct. They referenced his sister, and that was correct. But the only thing that didn't make sense is they said he had lived in Florida for the last 10 years. And I knew from the documents we found in the trunk, he had not lived in Florida for the last 10 years. He had spent a good deal of time back up here, up north. And he had lived in Lake Placid. So then I remembered that Melville Dewey started a town in Florida called Lake Placid after he started the Lake Placid Club. And then I looked on the map, and Lake Placid is just 100 miles west of West Palm Beach. And I think it's possible people heard him talk about living in Lake Placid, and they assumed it was Lake Placid, Florida. Because we all assume that the only Lake Placid is the one we know. I mean, we do that up here, but there is a Lake Placid in Florida. And I sort of suspect that's why the obituary is incorrect, but that's speculation. So after spending a long time doing the research and figuring all of this out and going through archives up here and archives down there and going through papers and laying them all on the floor, I guess you all are familiar with this if you've done research. You lay everything out, you lay out the dates, and you try to make it all work. I finally concluded his story, and this is what I have to say about it at the end. Dear Nelson, where were the people who knew you well, the people who might have written your spirit into that obituary, the ones who would have provided the real facts? How many friends did you have? Where were they when you died? Did anyone attend your funeral? Your burial plot was located, Section 27, Lot 41, in Hillcrest Memorial Park, which is in West Palm Beach. A phone call to an administrator there revealed that records show no stone was placed at your grave. An unvisited tomb, I fear. I think you were a lonely man, living a lonely life, a life lived far from your birthplace. Did your move to America bring what you were looking for? And then I go on for a little while, and then they end up with saying, this account of Nelson Blanchette's life stands as a tribute to the many French Canadians who migrated to America and enriched our culture and our economy. As such, it is an important addition to understanding the history, not only of America, but more specifically of the Adirondacks. So if you're interested, there's more about that in here. I would just end by mentioning, if I can find it, a quote that my husband, let's see where I put it, a quote that my husband translated for me from Cicero, who says about history, not knowing what happened before you were born is to be forever a child. I just think it's a great quote about history. I have books here if anyone's interested, but I think most of you know my books. But anyway, I think 40% of any sales here go back to historics, I believe. And that's it. If anyone has questions, happy to take them. Anybody? Anything? Okay, well, most of you know my books. Most of you know me. So you're all friends. It's nice to talk with you. Nice to meet you. And nice to be here. Thank you.